The night the Rosenfeld family gathered for Passover in the spring of 1943 carried a weight that even the seasoned Berlin winds seemed hesitant to disturb. A thin veil of soot drifted above the city, settling quietly over rooftops, chimneys, and the narrow courtyard of the tenement where the family had lived for generations. Inside the apartment, the warm glow of candles struggled against the heavy shadows that had settled on the building ever since the war began, casting distorted silhouettes on peeling wallpaper and wooden beams that creaked whenever anyone breathed too loudly. The table had been assembled with a diligence bordering on sacred, every detail meticulously arranged, as if the ritual itself might protect them from the hostile world beyond the thin window panes. In the center, a single place setting remained untouched, its plate white and empty, its silverware aligned with an almost chilling precision, its cup untouched by human hands. That seat belonged to 12-year-old Elias Rosenfeld, who had vanished only minutes before the family called him to dinner. The preparations had been unusually quiet that evening. Miriam, Elias's mother, moved around the kitchen like a ghost drifting between tasks, her fingers trembling every time the building groaned. She watched the window repeatedly, as if expecting something dreadful to appear out of the darkness. The tensions of wartime had drained whatever softness once lived in her expressions, leaving behind a face carved from worry. Across the room, her husband Joseph arranged the bitter herbs, flattening the linen cloth with a strange insistence on perfection. Their children, Ruth and the absent Elias, were the fragile reminders of normalcy in a world that no longer followed its own rules. Only hours before, Elias had been playing with a small metal puzzle he carried everywhere, its pieces clinking as he twisted them in his hands. Now the puzzle lay on the hallway floor, one piece separated from the rest, as if dropped mid-step. The family had assumed he was in his room when they finished setting the table. They had assumed he was simply delayed while preparing himself for the ceremony. But when the candles were lit and the first prayers prepared on Joseph's lips, a strange stillness filled the apartment. It was Ruth who first noticed. She looked to Elias's chair and then toward the corridor, her young face tightening with confusion. Joseph called for his son with a measured voice that attempted patience, but the silence that followed carried something unnatural. The air thickened, the building croaked again, the pipes clattered, and yet not a single sound came from Elias's small bedroom at the end of the hall. The untouched place setting seemed to gain weight, drawing all attention toward it. Miriam excused herself from the table and walked slowly down the corridor, the boards beneath her feet bending slightly, betraying her steps. She knocked on the door. No response. She called his name softly at first, then louder. The candles flickered as if reacting to her growing alarm. Joseph rose from his seat, abandoning the whisper of a prayer he had tried to begin. He joined her at the door, exchanged a glance with her, and pushed it open. Inside, the room appeared undisturbed, the bed neatly made, the wardrobe closed, the single window locked from the inside. On the small wooden desk, Elias's handwriting sprawled across an unfinished drawing of the Seder plate, a childish attempt to capture the tradition he loved. The room smelled faintly of candle wax and dust, but there was no Elias. For a moment the parents said nothing. The silence was thick enough to swallow their thoughts. Joseph called again, stepping into the room, pulling back the curtain as if expecting to find a child hiding behind it. Miriam checked beneath the bed, the wardrobe, even the small storage chest where Elias kept forgotten toys. Nothing. The room felt wrong, as if the absence had carved out a hollow shape that the walls themselves were trying not to acknowledge. When Joseph straightened up, the fear in his eyes matched Miriam's. Something had happened, something impossible and terribly quiet. They searched the hallway, the kitchen, the stairwell just outside the apartment. The building's corridors stretched dark and narrow, filled with the faint smell of damp stone and coal. A neighbor across the hall peeked through her cracked door, asking whether everything was all right, her voice thin with suspicion. Joseph waved her away with a stiff gesture. He could barely trust his own thoughts, let alone share them with someone else. When they returned to the dining room, the table seemed colder, the empty place setting almost glowing beneath the candlelight, like a silent accusation. The family stood frozen, staring at the untouched seat, as if it held an explanation. It held nothing. What unsettled Miriam most was that Elias had been exceptionally clingy in the days leading up to this. He had complained about nightmares, about strange sounds from the stairwell at night, about voices that echoed even when the building was quiet. She had dismissed them as the natural consequences of living under constant fear, the fear of inspections, of soldiers in the streets, of sudden knocks at the door. But now, amid the thickening dread of that Passover evening, those nightmares began to feel less like imagination and more like warnings. Each detail surfaced sharply. The way Elias refused to go into dark rooms alone, the way he kept asking whether their apartment was safe, the strange questions he whispered during the blackout drills. Something had been unsettling him, something he never fully explained. Before they could piece any of this together, the candles fluttered again. A cold draft slithered through the apartment even though the windows were shut tight. The linen cloth on the table lifted slightly at one corner, then settled. The family exchanged glances, but no one dared speak. Whatever had taken place occurred in the briefest sliver of time, slipping through the cracks of normality without leaving the faintest trace. In the center of the table, Elias's cup caught the candlelight and reflected it in a delicate waver that felt almost like movement. It was then that the dread blossomed fully in Miriam's chest. If Elias had left the apartment, they would have heard the door. If he had been taken, there would have been noise. But there was nothing. The quiet itself became evidence of something far more disturbing. In the middle of this suffocating tension, a thought drifted into Miriam's mind, one so irrational she tried to suppress it instantly. But fear has a way of amplifying what reason tries to bury. She remembered a story her grandmother used to tell during cold winter nights, a story about spirits that roamed during Passover, searching for lost souls, crossing boundaries that living people could not. She had always dismissed it as superstition, but standing in that dimly lit room with her son's place setting untouched, she felt that story coil around her spine with icy precision. There was no logic in her realization, yet it did not feel entirely ungrounded. Something unseen had brushed against their lives. The air in the room seemed to tighten further, as if listening. For a moment, a strange pressure built inside Miriam's ears, the way it does when descending into a deep tunnel. She blinked, unsure whether she was imagining it. Joseph looked at her questioningly, his brow furrowed. Ruth clung to the back of her chair, her breath quick and shallow. Children perceive what adults deny. She kept looking toward the hallway, as if expecting Elias to step out any second, as if she could almost hear him breathing behind the walls. At that moment, the narrator's voice in the future video must dip and linger, because now, dear viewer, In the middle of this suffocating uncertainty, let me ask you something softly and without breaking the tension. Where are you watching this from? The story that unfolds might feel closer than you expect. Sometimes disappearances penetrate even the safest rooms. The Rosenfelds were far from safe. Germany in 1943 was a labyrinth of terror disguised as order. People vanished not only because of soldiers or raids, but also because fear had become its own kind of predator. Elias's disappearance might have been one more tragedy swallowed by wartime chaos. Yet this case felt different. Too quiet, too precise, too sudden. Joseph tried to convince himself it was a wartime kidnapping, an abduction by someone who managed to slip in unnoticed. But even that explanation crumbled. No forced entry, no footprints, no neighbors heard anything. Nothing was out of place, except the boy himself. Then came the sound, a faint tapping from the far wall of the apartment. It lasted only 2 seconds. 3 notes tapped in slow succession like someone knocking from within the wall itself. Joseph stiffened. Miriam clasped her hands to her mouth. Ruth whispered her brother's name. But the tapping ceased as abruptly as it began. The wall returned to silence. The night deepened. The candles continued their stubborn flickering, as if fighting an invisible wind. Joseph insisted they search the basement. Miriam followed reluctantly, her legs trembling beneath her. The narrow staircase down to the cellar felt like a descent into the underbelly of the building, the air growing colder with each step. Their lantern cast a shaky glow on the stone walls. The basement was empty, save for stored crates and shadows. No boy, no sign of recent movement, but in the far corner lay a small imprint in the dust, barely noticeable, the faint outline of a child's shoe facing the wall. Joseph crouched to touch it. The dust shifted oddly, as if disturbed not by a step, but by something else entirely. When they returned to the dining room, the untouched place setting still waited. The cup seemed colder. The plate gleamed unnaturally beneath the candles. A chill prickled their skin. The Seder was abandoned, the prayers forgotten. The family sat in paralyzed silence, staring at a seat that should have been filled, wondering how a boy could vanish without opening a door, without making a sound, without leaving the smallest clue. It felt as though Elias had been erased from the very air around them, as if something had reached into their world and plucked him out with the quietness of a breath, disappearing into winter fog. The tension pressed on them like an invisible hand. Miriam whispered a prayer under her breath. Joseph held his daughter close, eyes fixed on the hallway. That untouched place, setting lingered like a thread that tied this moment to something older, something hidden, something waiting beyond the edges of understanding. And as the trembling candlelight closed the first chapter of this terrifying night, a soft reminder must slip naturally through the narrative, dark as the room itself. If you wish to remain with this family as their nightmare deepens, if you want to follow the shadows that swallowed young Elias Rosenfeld, consider lingering with us in this place. Subscribe so the echoes of his disappearance reach you wherever you are. The morning that followed the vanished boy's Passover dinner was unlike any other the Rosenfelds had lived through. The gray light that filtered through the window panes was pale and lifeless, bending across the dust in the air like a memory struggling to take form. Miriam had not slept. She sat by the table the entire night, her body motionless except for the trembling of her fingers around a candle that had burned itself down to a shallow pool of wax. The untouched plate still rested before her, now cold, the faint shadow of dried candle smoke trailing above it like an omen. Joseph stood near the window, watching the street below, where soldiers occasionally marched through, boots striking the cobblestones in a rhythm that no longer startled anyone. He was trying to convince himself that morning light brought clarity, that daylight could explain what the night had concealed. But daylight did not bring Elias back. The first hours after dawn were consumed by futile attempts at reasoning. Joseph checked every lock, every door, every window again, as though repetition might reveal a hidden flaw. He inspected the floorboards, the corridor, even the narrow gaps behind the furniture. He tried to reconstruct every sound of the night, every breath, every creak, every flicker of the candles, as if the truth might be buried somewhere in those forgotten moments. Miriam's voice had grown hoarse from calling Elias's name, her pleas echoing faintly against the walls like a prayer unanswered. Ruth, their daughter, sat silently by the window clutching her brother's puzzle, turning it over in her small hands, tracing the missing piece with her thumb. There was no longer any pretense of calm, only waiting, only dread. By mid-morning, Joseph decided they had no choice but to report the disappearance, though even that decision came with danger. A Jewish family drawing attention to themselves in 1943. Berlin was like a wounded bird inviting the hunter's gaze. But silence was unbearable. He put on his threadbare coat, the same one he had worn since the first winter of the war, and stepped into the hall. Miriam followed him to the door, her eyes pleading silently for reassurance he could not give. The stairwell was dim, the air heavy with dampness and the faint odor of coal. Every sound echoed too loudly, the clatter of his shoes, the faint whine of a neighbor's door closing somewhere above. He felt eyes watching from behind shutters. The world had become a place where every whisper carried suspicion. At the precinct, the officer on duty barely looked up when Joseph explained his son's disappearance. The man's uniform was immaculate, his expression bored. He wrote slowly, as if the story he was hearing was nothing but a distraction from his routine. When Joseph described how the boy had vanished without a trace, the officer smirked faintly. He asked whether Joseph was certain the boy had not simply run off. Frightened by the war or the curfews, Joseph tried to insist otherwise, but the officer waved him off with a lazy motion. "Children disappear every day," he said, his tone indifferent, his pen scratching idly at the paper. "Be grateful if the authorities don't find him in the wrong company." There was something in the way he said it, half warning, half accusation, that made Joseph's stomach turn. He left the station with nothing but a meaningless slip of paper, his hands trembling with impotent rage. When he returned home, the apartment felt colder. Miriam had lit more candles, as if trying to summon warmth through firelight alone. Ruth had fallen asleep on the couch, her small hand still gripping Elias's puzzle. Joseph placed the slip of paper on the table without a word. Miriam glanced at it, then back at him. "They won't help us?" she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a truth, spoken aloud. And behind that truth lingered another darker one. If the authorities would not help, who would? That afternoon something strange happened. As the hours dragged on and silence settled thickly again, a sound broke through it, the faint chime of metal against metal. Miriam froze. Joseph turned his head sharply. The sound came from Elias's room. It was unmistakable, the delicate clinking of the small metal puzzle he had carried everywhere. But that was impossible. The puzzle had been in Ruth's hands the entire time. Joseph moved toward the corridor, his steps cautious. The door to Elias's room stood slightly ajar now, though he remembered leaving it closed. The air was still, yet a subtle vibration seemed to hum just beneath the surface of sound, like the echo of something unseen. He pushed the door open. The room appeared exactly as it had the night before, the bed untouched, the desk still holding the unfinished drawing, the air stale and faintly cold. Yet on the floor, by the foot of the bed, lay a single piece of the puzzle, one that had been missing since the night Elias vanished. Joseph bent to pick it up, his hand trembling. The metal was icy to the touch, colder than it should have been. When he turned it over in his palm, he noticed something etched into it that he hadn't seen before, a faint scratch, deliberate and almost letter-like, though too small to decipher. He called for Miriam, his voice shaking. She came to the doorway, her face drained of color. He showed her the piece. Her eyes widened. It was unmistakably Elias's, but how could it have appeared there after they had searched the entire room? From that moment, fear took a new shape. It was no longer just absence or grief. It was presence. A presence that filled the apartment, silent and watching. Miriam began to hear whispers at night, too faint to distinguish words, like the sound of breathing filtered through water. Joseph started finding small disturbances. A drawer slightly open, a book displaced, a candle burned lower than it should have been. Each detail on its own seemed meaningless, but together they built a pattern, one that neither of them dared to speak aloud. It was as if the boy had never truly left, or as if something pretending to be him lingered in his place. Ruth, too, began to change. She would wake in the middle of the night crying, insisting she heard Elias calling her name from the hallway. When Joseph tried to comfort her, she described a voice that wasn't quite his, softer, slower, echoing in a way that made her afraid. She said he wanted her to come and look out the window to see where he had gone. But when they checked, there was nothing outside except the same dark courtyard and the same heavy silence. Children have ways of sensing what adults cannot. Whatever had taken Elias seemed to be reaching for her, too. The tension in the apartment grew unbearable. The neighbors began avoiding the Rosenfelds altogether. Some whispered that the family was cursed. Others said they had brought it upon themselves by continuing their rituals when so many had abandoned faith. Joseph stopped leaving the apartment except for food rations. Miriam stopped singing. Ruth stopped smiling. The untouched place setting remained on the table, now more symbol than hope, as if removing it would erase the last connection they had to their son. One evening, 3 days after Elias's disappearance, Joseph decided to seek help beyond official channels. There was an old man who lived 2 streets away, known quietly among the Jewish community as a keeper of stories and forbidden knowledge. His name was Abram Klein. Before the war, he had been a scholar of folklore, a collector of tales that blurred the lines between history and the supernatural. The Nazis had banned his work, destroyed his library, and driven him into silence. But some said he still listened, still remembered. Joseph approached his door at dusk, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. When the old man opened the door, his eyes were pale and unblinking, his expression calm but knowing. "You've lost someone," he said, before Joseph could speak. His voice was soft, rasped by age, but carried a strange certainty. Inside, Abram's small apartment smelled of parchment and candle wax. Books lined the walls, their spines cracked and faded. Joseph explained everything, every impossible detail, the untouched setting, the sudden silence, the metal piece that reappeared. Abram listened without interruption. When Joseph finished, the old man leaned forward. "There are stories," he said slowly, "of souls that are taken during holy nights, when the boundary between our world and the other begins to thin. Passover is not only a celebration of deliverance, it is also a reminder of the spirits that wander still, those who were never delivered." Joseph tried to protest, insisting he wasn't there for myths, but Abram raised a trembling hand. "You misunderstand. These are not just stories. They are warnings." He explained that during the old rituals, a single place at the table was sometimes left open, not only for the prophet Elijah, but also to ensure that no wandering spirit mistook the living for the dead. To forget that boundary, to invite a name, to leave an opening without protection, was to risk allowing something in. Joseph's mind reeled. He thought of the untouched plate, the cup, the missing boy. He asked what he could do. Abram handed him a small pouch of salt and whispered a prayer in Hebrew, one that Miriam would later repeat until her voice broke. "The salt binds what was separated," Abram said, "but if he has already gone beyond, then nothing binds him anymore." That night, Joseph returned home, clutching the pouch, as if it contained the last thread of hope. He sprinkled the salt along the doorway and around Elias's room, whispering the prayer through trembling lips. For a moment, the air seemed to still. Even the candlelight froze in place, its flame unnaturally still, no longer swaying. Then slowly, the room exhaled. The air grew colder. Somewhere deep within the walls, the faint tapping began again. 3 soft knocks, steady and patient. The salty did not stop it. Miriam screamed his name, but Joseph held her back, terrified of what might answer. Ruth hid beneath the table, her small body shaking. The knocking grew louder, then ceased abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt like the pause between heartbeats. When Joseph dared to move again, he looked toward the untouched plate on the table. The cup that had remained upright since the first night was now tipped over, the red wine seeping into the linen like a spreading wound. The next morning, there was another change. The drawing on Elias's desk, the one he had been working on before the Seder, was no longer as it had been. The lines had shifted, faint but clear. Where once there had been a simple outline of a Seder plate, there was now something else drawn faintly over it. The vague shape of a doorway, flanked by symbols Joseph could not recognize. The pencil lay on the desk beside it, sharpened to a fine point. It was as if someone, or something, had continued Elias's work in the night. The Rosenfeld apartment had become a place where reason no longer ruled, where time itself seemed to bend. The war outside felt distant, almost irrelevant. Their battle was not with soldiers or sirens. It was with the silence, with the empty chair, with the unseen presence that hovered between rooms. And deep down, both Joseph and Miriam began to suspect that their son was neither entirely lost nor entirely gone, that he existed somewhere in between, waiting for them to see what he had seen. And if you're still with us here, following the candlelight deeper into this family's descent, stay close, because what comes next will blur not only faith and fear, but life and what lingers beyond it. Stay subscribed, keep the lights low, and listen carefully. The echoes in Elias's home are growing louder. By the 4th night after Elias's disappearance, the Rosenfeld apartment no longer felt like a place of the living. The shadows had deepened, thick and deliberate, creeping across the walls as though claiming new territory with each passing hour. The silence was no longer empty. It breathed, it pulsed, it waited. Outside, The air raid sirens howled intermittently, their moaning rising over Berlin's war-torn skyline. But inside, the noise barely mattered. The family had stopped reacting to it altogether. It was as if they had slipped into a different kind of war, one that no one else could see. Miriam barely left Elias's room anymore. She would sit by his bed, hands folded in her lap, her lips moving constantly in whispered prayers that blended into the low hum of the building. Joseph tried to maintain some sense of routine. He fetched rations, repaired small things around the flat, pretended to read the newspaper, though his eyes never focused on the words. But every movement felt hollow, as though they were actors performing the memory of their former lives. Ruth, fragile and pale, had taken to drawing as her brother once did. Her sketches were strange, always the same image repeated again and again, a small doorway drawn in charcoal, standing in a dark corridor, a faint silhouette of a child standing beyond it. When Joseph asked her what the doorway meant, she replied without looking up, "That's where Elias is waiting." The strange occurrences had grown more frequent. Objects moved subtly during the night. A chair slightly turned toward the hall, a curtain drawn closed that no one remembered touching. The air sometimes carried a faint, metallic smell, sharp and cold. The candles flickered even when there was no draft, and each dawn, when the gray light crawled into Elias's room, the salt lines Joseph had laid down the night before were always disturbed, scattered in tiny spirals as though something had traced symbols in them while the family slept. The neighbors no longer came near. They had begun whispering that the Rosenfelds were cursed, or that the Gestapo would soon come for them because of the noises and lights at odd hours. One night, an upstairs neighbor knocked, demanding silence. When Joseph opened the door, the man froze. He said he'd heard a child crying from inside, calling in a language he didn't understand. Joseph's mouth went dry. There had been no child crying, only the soft murmurs of Miriam's prayers. The man's face drained of color, and he left without another word. After that, no one knocked again. It was on the fifth night that the sound returned. Not the knocking this time, but the whisper. It came faintly from the wall between Elias's room and the kitchen, like a voice pressed tightly against plaster. Miriam heard it first. She thought it was her imagination, the trick of exhaustion, but then the voice formed her name. Softly, slowly. "Mama." Her body froze. The candle flame beside her leaned sharply, as if drawn toward the sound. She leaned closer, pressing her ear to the wall. Again the voice came, whispered, stretched, strangely echoing, as though traveling from very far away. "Mama, it's cold." She screamed for Joseph. When he came, she pointed to the wall, tears streaking her face. He pressed his own ear to it. At first there was only silence, the deep and patient kind that fills old buildings. But then he heard it too, a faint scrape, a breath, a soft call that twisted his stomach. He stepped back quickly, shaking his head, refusing to accept what he had heard. "It's not him," he said. "It can't be him." Miriam collapsed into sobs, her body folding over the bed. Later that night, unable to bear the stillness, Joseph lit another candle and examined the wall carefully. He tapped on it, listening for hollowness. The sound was faint, but consistent. He fetched a hammer and began gently prying away the plaster near the floorboard, more to reassure himself than to find anything. But beneath the first thin layer of crumbling material, his tool struck something unexpected, a hollow cavity, small and rectangular, like an old vent that had been sealed long ago. He widened the gap and peered inside. The air that drifted out was stale and cold. Inside, partially buried in dust, lay a small object, Elias's other shoe. Yosef staggered backward, his breath catching. The shoe was unmistakably his son's. The worn leather, the scuffed toe, the missing lace. He pulled it free, his hands trembling. The sight of it seemed to drain the remaining color from the room. Miriam clutched it to her chest, whispering Elias's name over and over like a mantra. But Yosef's mind had already gone elsewhere. Back to Abram Klein's warning, the boundary between worlds, the open place at the table, the invitation that had never been closed. He began to wonder whether what had happened was not merely a disappearance, but a kind of crossing. Perhaps Elias had not been taken away from them. Perhaps he had been drawn somewhere that had always been waiting behind the walls. The next day, Yosef returned to Abram. He carried the shoe in a small paper bag, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. When the old scholar saw him, he did not seem surprised. "You found something," Abram said softly. Joseph nodded, placing the shoe on the table. Abram studied it for a long time, running his fingers along the cracked leather. "The child is near," he murmured, "but not in the way you think. There are thresholds in old places like yours. The war has weakened them. The fear, the prayers, the deaths. It all thins the veil between our world and the one that feeds on memory." He rose and began searching among his books until he found a thin, torn volume with no title on its cover. He opened it carefully, its pages yellowed and fragile. On one of the pages was an illustration of a ritual table, almost identical to the Rosenfeld's Passover setting, except that at the edge of the table sat a figure drawn in shadow, faceless, its hands resting beside an untouched plate. Beneath the image was a single word in faded ink, "Ha-Petash," the opening. Abram explained that in certain ancient traditions, a ritual gone incomplete could act as a door. "If something called your boy," he said, "it might have used the ritual itself. The cup, the plate, the prayer, interrupted, they form a bridge." Joseph stared at the page, his throat tight. He asked whether the bridge could be closed. Abram hesitated. "If the spirit has not anchored itself yet, perhaps. But if it has found a vessel, even a memory to cling to, it will not leave easily. It feeds on remembrance." Yosef thought of the untouched place setting, still sitting exactly as Elias had left it. He thought of Miriam's constant prayers, of Ruth's drawings, of the apartment itself filled with his son's name. Every action, every word was an anchor. Abram gave him a candle made of black wax and instructed him to light it at midnight, reciting a particular psalm backward, sealing the plate and cup with salt and ash. It sounded more like superstition than salvation, but Yosef would have done anything. He returned home and prepared everything as instructed. The candle burned with a faint blue flame, its light weak and trembling. He spoke the psalm in a broken whisper. Miriam held the cup in her hands, tears spilling freely. Ruth watched from the corner, her eyes too wide for her small face. When Joseph reached the final line, the air seemed to tighten, the flame stretching tall and straight. Then suddenly, every candle in the room went out at once. The blue light died. The apartment plunged into darkness. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then came the sound. A faint shuffle from Elias's room, followed by a slow creak, as though the window had opened by itself. Miriam screamed. Joseph stumbled toward the doorway, but the darkness was absolute. suffocating. He could hear Ruth crying somewhere behind him. Then, as if from within the blackness itself, Elias's voice whispered again, clearer this time, "Papa." The word froze Joseph in place. It was not a memory. It was real, immediate, too close. He reached into the dark, calling his son's name, but his hand met nothing, only the cold. Then the sound of footsteps retreating down the corridor, soft, deliberate, fading toward the kitchen. When the light returned, when the candle suddenly flared back to life, the kitchen door was open. On the table, beside the untouched plate, sat the metal puzzle, now fully assembled, but no one had touched it. The family stood in stunned silence. Joseph approached slowly. The puzzle's interlocking rings gleamed faintly in the dim light, their metal now tarnished with something darker than rust. On the tablecloth beneath it, small grains of salt formed a shape. A doorway, just like in Ruth's drawings. From that night on, Joseph stopped denying what he had once called madness. He began keeping watch at the table every midnight, whispering prayers, studying the shadows for movement. Miriam continued to pray, her voice hoarse, her mind unraveling. Ruth's drawings became more frantic, doorways upon doorways, all leading deeper into the dark. Once, Joseph caught her whispering to her brother's empty chair, asking him whether he was lonely. She paused, then nodded, as if listening to a response no one else could hear. The days outside the apartment grew worse. The Gestapo began sweeping the neighborhood. Families disappeared overnight, taken away without reason. Joseph's co-workers at the factory stopped speaking to him. The world was collapsing, yet inside their walls another collapse was already complete. The Rosenfelds were prisoners not of the war, but of their own home, bound to an absence that refused to fade. And still, every night, that untouched place setting waited, its plate empty, its cup upright, its silverware cold. The seat across the table seemed to shimmer faintly at times, as though occupied by something unseen. Miriam swore she could see the faint impression of small hands in the dust. Joseph could not bring himself to look too long. The air in that corner was always colder. By the end of the second week, the apartment's atmosphere had become unbearable. The walls seemed to hum softly at night, like a voice hidden behind layers of stone. Ruth fell ill, her body weak, her fever high. She muttered Elias's name in her sleep, sometimes reaching out as if to touch someone standing beside her bed. Miriam spent hours weeping beside her, whispering promises she no longer believed. Joseph sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the candle, at the plate, at the empty seat that had started to cast its own shadow on the wall. It was then that he made a decision. He would destroy the table, burn it if he had to, and end whatever connection it had formed. But when he tried to move the plate, it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had become part of the table itself. The realization broke something inside him. He sank to his knees, clutching his head, whispering Elias's name over and over until the words became meaningless sound. The flame flickered violently, then stilled. A faint breath brushed against his ear, so soft he almost doubted it. "Don't forget me." The line between life and memory had dissolved entirely, and now, as the candle burns low and the Rosenfelds slip deeper into their private abyss, it is time for you to decide whether to follow them further. There are still 3 more nights ahead, and each one will reveal something worse. Stay close to the shadows. Keep the light low. And if you haven't already, Subscribe so you don't look away when the next door opens. The winter wind outside had turned merciless by the third week after Elias's disappearance, howling through the alleys like a restless spirit seeking entry. Berlin was sinking deeper into darkness. Bombings, shortages, neighbors vanishing quietly into the night. Yet for the Rosenfelds, the true terror had long since moved indoors. Their apartment, once a fragile sanctuary against the world's cruelty, had become a maze of whispers, flickering light, and unending dread. Every corner held the weight of unseen eyes. Every sound seemed to echo from somewhere just beyond reach. Miriam had stopped speaking entirely. She drifted through the rooms like a phantom, her hair disheveled, her skin pale and translucent beneath the candlelight. Sometimes Joseph would find her standing at Elias's door, hand pressed against the wood, whispering a lullaby so faint it barely carried beyond her lips. Ruth was confined to bed, her fever rising and falling in unpredictable waves. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words chilled the blood in her parents' veins. "He's not lost," she whispered one morning, her eyes glassy. "He's waiting in the wall." The doctor refused to come. He claimed to be too busy, but Joseph saw the fear in his eyes when he mentioned the apartment's address. Rumors had spread. Some said the Rosenfeld home was cursed, others that it was haunted by the sins of its occupants. In a city devoured by horror, even superstition had become a language of survival. Joseph's faith had fractured. He prayed less, cursed more. He began drinking what little brandy remained in the cupboard, hoping it would dull the edges of the things he heard at night. But alcohol offered no escape from the sounds. The low knocking that came irregularly from behind the walls, the soft scrape of something small dragging across the floor when no one was near. The untouched place setting had not been moved in over 2 weeks. Yet every morning its position seemed slightly different. The cup no longer stood upright. Sometimes it leaned, other times it was placed closer to the chair, as if waiting for someone to reach for it. One evening, desperate and trembling, Joseph returned once again to Abram Klein. The old scholar was weaker now, coughing between every few words. The color drained from his skin. Still, when Joseph entered, Abram looked up as though he had been expecting him. "You didn't finish the ritual," he said, his voice rasping. Something interfered. Joseph placed both hands on the table. "It wasn't my fault." The candle went out. Everything went black. Abram nodded slowly, his gaze distant. Then the door was opened wider. He reached for another of his books, a thick leather-bound volume with symbols burned into the cover. When he opened it, the ink appeared faded, almost eroded by time. "There are 2 ways a spirit may cross," he explained. "One is to take, the other is to be invited. The first leaves behind silence. The second leaves behind echoes." Joseph listened, his hands trembling. Abram turned a page, revealing a crude illustration of a family seated at a ritual table. One chair was empty, its shadow drawn darker than the rest. Beneath it, a faint inscription read, "The feast of remembrance must never be interrupted, or the soul will hunger for return." "The soul," Abram whispered, "if called before its time, clings to those who remember it. Your boy, if he is truly gone, may be trapped between worlds, fed by the memory of those who mourn him. Every prayer you say, every tear you shed, keeps him tethered, but not him alone. Others might find that tether and follow." Joseph felt the words sink like lead in his chest. Others. The idea that Elias's voice might have opened the way for something else, something older, filled him with a dread beyond measure. He asked what could be done, but Abram hesitated. If the spirit is anchored to the ritual must be completed. But completing it means inviting what remains to join the living once more. You must see it. You must face it. Only then can you send it back. He warned Joseph that the attempt could destroy him. The boundary is thin now. The war has weakened everything, the walls, the faith, the mind. Be certain of your strength, or the opening will consume you as well. Joseph said nothing. He only asked for the instructions. Abram handed him a single candle, made from a mixture of salt and tallow, its wick black as ash. Light it at the hour between days, he said. When the world is neither yesterday nor tomorrow, the boy will answer, but it may not be your boy who speaks. That night, Joseph prepared the apartment. He sent Miriam and Ruth to the bedroom, though he knew Miriam would not sleep. The walls felt alive, pulsing faintly as if they were breathing. The air was colder than it should have been. He placed the candle at the center of the table, beside Elias's untouched plate, and lit it. The flame flared with a pale blue hue, steady and unnaturally bright. The moment it caught, the air fell silent. Even the ticking of the wall clock stopped. Joseph whispered the psalm as Abram had instructed, though his voice wavered halfway through. The candlelight flickered, stretched, then bent toward Elias's empty chair. The plate began to tremble slightly, its edges clinking against the wood. The cup tipped forward, spilling a thin stream of red wine that crawled across the linen like blood seeping from a wound. Then came the voice. It was faint at first, a low hum, the sound of breathing within the walls. Then it sharpened, forming a single word that sliced through the air. Papa. Joseph froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Elias's. He turned toward the sound, his eyes wide, heart hammering. Elias, he whispered. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then the voice again, closer now. It's dark, Papa. I can't find the light. Tears burned his eyes. Where are you? He pleaded. In the space behind, came the reply. They won't let me go. Joseph's breath hitched. Who won't let you go? For a moment, the silence stretched long and taut. Then, faintly, he heard another sound beneath the boy's voice, a chorus of whispers, low and tangled, speaking in languages he didn't know. The candle's flame thinned to a trembling thread, and the shadows on the walls began to move, elongating, bending toward him. He felt something cold brush the back of his neck. He whispered the final lines of the psalm, voice breaking. The candles he sputtered violently, the blue flame splitting into two. For a fraction of a second, he saw a shape seated in Elias's chair, a small silhouette, shoulders hunched, head bowed. But its face was obscured by shadow, its outline blurred, wrong. It lifted its head slowly, and though Joseph couldn't see eyes, he felt its gaze pierce through him like ice. Then everything went black. He awoke on the floor hours later. The candle burned down to nothing but hardened wax. The place setting was gone. The plate, the cup, even the silverware, vanished. In their place lay the metal puzzle, disassembled again into its separate pieces. On the tablecloth, faint soot marks formed a pattern. 2 small handprints. When Joseph called for Miriam, she did not answer. He found her in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, her expression vacant. Ruth lay beside her, her fever broken, her breathing shallow but calm. In her hand was one of the puzzle pieces. She was smiling faintly in her sleep. "He's with me now," she whispered, though her lips barely moved. From that night onward, Ruth changed. She began speaking less, but when she did, her voice carried strange inflections, rhythms that didn't belong to a child. Sometimes she would hum a tune that Miriam swore she had sung to Elias when he was a baby, though Ruth could not have remembered it. Other times, she would sit at the table, tracing circles with her finger on the wood, murmuring in tones too low to hear clearly. Joseph could not look at her without guilt gnawing at his heart. He had wanted to bring his son back, but instead he feared he had brought something else. The following week, the bombings intensified. Buildings nearby collapsed under the rain of fire. The Rosenfelds' windows shattered, glass littering the floor like ice. And yet, miraculously, their apartment remained standing. No flames touched it. Neighbors whispered that death avoided their home because it was already claimed. One night, after another raid, Joseph walked through the ruins of the hallway, his ears ringing from the blasts. When he entered the kitchen, he stopped dead in his tracks. The table had been restored, the plate, the cup, the silverware, all back in place, perfectly arranged. At the center lay the candle, unburned. The untouched seat seemed to pulse faintly, the air above it shimmering as if from heat, though the room was freezing. Then he saw her, Ruth, standing in the corner, staring at the chair. "He's hungry," she said softly. Miriam appeared behind her, eyes wide with terror. "Joseph," she whispered, "don't touch anything." But he couldn't move. The candle's wick caught fire without a spark, burning once more with the same unnatural blue light. A faint outline appeared in the chair, small, indistinct, flickering between presence and absence. The whisper came again, no longer just Elias's voice, but layered with countless others, old and cracked and endless. Joseph fell to his knees, clutching his head. Miriam screamed. Ruth reached for the chair. The shadows surged, filling the room with motion, with breath, with the echo of all that had been lost. Then, silence. When morning came, the apartment was still. The table was empty again. Only the faint smell of candle smoke lingered. Ruth slept soundly, her hand closed around the last piece of the puzzle. Joseph and Miriam sat together, unable to speak, unable to weep. Something had shifted irreversibly. The boundary had been crossed, and they were no longer sure which side they stood on. Days later, Joseph returned to Abram once more, but the old scholar's apartment was empty. The door hung ajar, the rooms stripped bare. On the wall above the desk, carved into the plaster, was a single word in shaky Hebrew letters, Hapetach, the opening. Joseph understood then that whatever door had been opened that night was not meant for one family alone. It was older, larger, something that had been waiting through centuries of ritual and remembrance, feeding on faith and fear alike. Elias's disappearance had only been the beginning, a spark in a chain of forgotten fires. And as the cold wind scraped across the bombed-out city, carrying with it the scent of ash and iron, the Rosenfeld apartment stood untouched amid ruin, its single candle still burning faintly in the window. Some said it was a sign of hope. Others, who knew the story, called it something else entirely, a beacon for those who had never truly left. And if you have followed this far into the shadows of faith, war, and loss, don't look away now. The final truth waits in what comes next. Stay close and let the story lead you deeper. Like this if you feel the cold spreading too, and make sure you remain subscribed, because the next night, the last door will open. The city was dying, yet inside the Rosenfeld apartment, something continued to stir. Winter had frozen Berlin into a colorless graveyard of snow and ruin. Buildings stood half-collapsed, their interiors exposed like rib cages. People vanished daily, some taken by soldiers, others by hunger, disease, or the silent despair that made men walk into the dark and never return. But inside the apartment on Köpenicker Strasse, where the walls whispered and the candles never burned the same color twice, the Rosenfeld family lived suspended in a reality the war could not touch. Their fear had transcended the bombs. It had taken root in something older and quieter. Joseph no longer counted the days since Elias had disappeared. The calendar had lost meaning. He rose at dusk and slept at dawn, though sleep came rarely. The apartment's sounds had grown rhythmic, almost purposeful. The creak of floorboards at set intervals, the slow, wet tap from the leaking pipe that seemed to echo like a heartbeat. And then, always, the whisper. Sometimes faint, sometimes almost human. It came from the walls, from the floor, from the very air between breaths. Miriam no longer reacted to it. She drifted like a shadow, her lips pale, her eyes glassy. Ruth was the only one who seemed alive, and yet not entirely herself. Her fever had vanished, but what remained was worse. She moved with deliberate calm, as if she were listening to something just beneath the threshold of sound. Often, Joseph would wake at night to find her sitting at the kitchen table, the puzzle pieces spread before her, rearranging them slowly, methodically, into patterns that made no sense. Sometimes, she whispered to someone invisible, her tone soothing, maternal, as if comforting a frightened child. Other times, her eyes would flick upward toward the ceiling, unfocused, as though she were watching something move above them. When Joseph tried to speak to her, she smiled faintly and said, "He's learning to talk again." The words turned his blood to ice. He tried to take the puzzle away from her once. She didn't fight, didn't scream. She only looked at him, her eyes so calm it unsettled him more than any rage could have. "You'll make him angry," she said softly. He froze, the metal pieces cold in his palm. She turned back toward the empty chair at the table, her gaze fixed on it, as if waiting for something to sit down. Joseph backed away slowly, leaving the pieces where they were. That night he dreamed of Elias, not the way he had been, but altered, older somehow, though still a child. In the dream, Elias stood at the far end of the corridor, his skin the color of ash, his eyes like two deep hollows reflecting candlelight. He said nothing, but when Joseph tried to move toward him, the corridor stretched endlessly, each step pulling him further away. Then Elias raised his hand, and the walls began to bleed salt. Joseph woke, gasping, the taste of metal on his tongue. In the dim light of dawn, he found that the salt lines he had drawn around the doors had indeed been disturbed again. This time not scattered, but rearranged into small concentric circles, spiraling inward toward Elias's chair. The cup on the table was filled once more, though neither he nor Miriam had poured it. The smell of red wine filled the air, thick and sweet. He thought of Abram Klein and the missing scholar, of the empty apartment and the word Hapetage carved into the wall, the opening. Joseph began to suspect that the old man had not disappeared by accident. Perhaps he, too, had crossed whatever threshold Elias had found. Perhaps there were many such doors scattered through the city, hidden behind the rituals of faith and grief. And perhaps each one had found its keeper. That day, for the first time in weeks, Joseph left the apartment in daylight. The streets were quiet, dusted with ash and snow. He passed hollow-eyed soldiers, women carrying buckets of melted ice, and a priest who avoided his gaze. The city no longer felt real. It was a stage of ruins where ghosts performed the last scenes of humanity. He wandered aimlessly until he reached what had once been the synagogue, now a burnt shell. Its walls still stood, blackened by fire, its Star of David shattered and half buried in the snow. He entered through a gap in the wall. The air inside was colder than the streets. At the far end of the hall, beneath the remains of the ark, someone had drawn symbols in the soot, circles, lines, and a shape that resembled the doorway Ruth had been drawing over and over. Joseph felt the world tilt. He knelt, touching the pattern with trembling fingers. The soot smeared, revealing faint writing beneath. He waits between. He fled before he could read more. When he returned home, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. The air was heavy, almost thick. The candles had all burned out except one. The black tallow candle Abram had given him. It burned steadily on the table, though he hadn't lit it. Miriam was nowhere in sight. Ruth sat at the table, humming. Her voice was soft, steady, childlike. The melody was the same lullaby Miriam used to sing to Elias before the war. "Where's your mother?" Joseph asked, his voice shaking. Ruth didn't answer. She reached into her pocket and pulled out one of the puzzle pieces, pressing it to her chest. "He's almost ready," she whispered. "He said Mama's helping." Joseph felt something break inside him. He moved to the bedroom, the air colder with each step. The door creaked open, and his breath caught. Miriam was kneeling before the wall, her hands pressed flat against it. She was whispering rapidly, her voice low and frantic. The plaster beneath her fingers was cracking, small fissures branching outward like veins. "Miriam!" he cried, grabbing her shoulders. She turned slowly. Her face was pale, streaked with dust, her eyes distant. "He's so close," she said. "Just one more prayer." He dragged her away, shouting for her to stop, but the wall continued to split. A thin line of darkness seeped through, as if the space behind it was not hollow, but infinite. The temperature dropped sharply, frost blooming on the edges of the cracks. The candle in the other room flickered violently, its flame bending toward the bedroom. Ruth appeared in the doorway, clutching the puzzle. "He's coming," she said softly. "He promised he'd come back if we made room." The wall groaned, a deep sound that seemed to rise from the bones of the building itself. The crack widened, a long vertical line splitting the plaster from floor to ceiling. And for a moment, just a moment, Joseph thought he saw movement within it. A faint glow, a shimmer of something like light distorted through water. Then from that impossible slit, a hand emerged. Small, pale, childlike. Elias's hand. Miriam screamed. Joseph stumbled backward, dragging her with him. The hand reached outward, grasping at the air, fingers twitching as though trying to remember how to move. But what followed was not the rest of the boy's body. It was shadow, a thick living darkness that poured through the gap like smoke, spreading across the room, swallowing the candle light. The temperature plunged until their breath came out as white mist. Then came the voice again, but no longer gentle, no longer Elias's alone. It spoke in layers, the tones of hundreds overlapping, whispering through one another. "You called. You remembered. The door is open." Joseph held Miriam close, whispering prayers through chattering teeth. But every word he spoke seemed to echo back to him from the walls, twisted, reversed, mocking. The shadows surged, forming vague shapes that flickered between human and not. Faces appeared and vanished, men, women, children, all blurred, all whispering the same phrase, "We remember." The door in the wall began to close, the crack sealing itself with a dry, snapping sound. The shadows retreated, pulled back into the narrowing slit, but not before one final whisper slipped through. He stayed. When the light returned, the wall was whole again, smooth, unbroken. The air warmed slightly, but the room no longer felt the same. It felt empty, not peaceful, but drained, like something vital had been taken with the retreating dark. Miriam collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. Ruth fainted. Joseph stood frozen, his mind unable to comprehend what he had seen. The next morning, Elias's chair was gone. The plate and cup had vanished once more, leaving only the faint impression of their shapes in the dust. The puzzle, however, remained, fully assembled, resting at the center of the table. Ruth awoke hours later, her eyes clear for the first time in weeks. When Joseph asked her what had happened, she smiled faintly. "He's home now," she said. Miriam would never speak again. She withdrew completely, her mind retreating to a place no one could follow. She spent her days sitting by the wall, humming softly, waiting for something only she could hear. Joseph began writing, filling pages with fragmented thoughts, sketches of symbols he'd seen, desperate attempts to make sense of the impossible. His handwriting grew erratic, the ink blotted by shaking hands. Outside, the war neared its end. The sounds of distant artillery replaced the sirens. The city was crumbling, yet within that apartment, the family existed, outside time. The table stood untouched, the puzzle gleaming faintly in the dim light. Occasionally, when the wind rose, the faint sound of metal clinking could be heard. Soft, rhythmic, like the hands of a child playing with his favorite toy. And once, in the dead of night, as Joseph sat half asleep in his chair, he heard a voice behind him, a whisper, warm and familiar. "Papa." He turned, heart pounding, but there was no one there, only the faint indentation of small hands on the dust-covered table. He didn't scream, he didn't cry, he only whispered back, "I remember." And perhaps that was what the thing had wanted all along, to be remembered, to be named, to be invited to sit among the living once more. So, if you're still here, following these shadows through the corridors of the forgotten, don't forget to keep your light low and your memory sharp, because memory, as you've seen, is the only door the dead truly need. Like this, if you're still watching in the dark, and prepare yourself, for in the next part, the last night falls, and the truth of what Elias became will finally step fully into the light. The final winter of the war came quietly, as if the city itself had grown too weary to resist. Berlin was a skeleton of what it had once been, the bones of its buildings jutting out against a sky the color of smoke. The streets were buried in snow and silence. Those who remained moved like phantoms between ruins, their faces hollow, their voices low. The Rosenfeld apartment still stood, untouched by bombs or fire, a small island of stillness in a city consumed by death. But the stillness within those walls was not peace. It was the kind that comes after something ancient has been awakened, the quiet that follows when there are no prayers left to say. Joseph no longer kept track of time. The clocks had stopped weeks ago, and he had not wound them again. The candle in the window still burned, though he could no longer recall lighting it. It burned steadily, endlessly, its flame pale and blue, like the eye of a storm that never moved. The puzzle remained on the table, perfectly assembled. Miriam sat near the wall most days, her voice reduced to a faint hum, the same lullaby over and over. She no longer looked at Joseph when he spoke. Sometimes she smiled for no reason at all, as if she were listening to someone only she could hear. Ruth had changed completely. She was quiet, calm, obedient, too calm. Her movements were deliberate, her eyes unfocused. When she spoke, it was rarely as herself. "He likes it when you sit here," she would say, pointing to Elias's old chair. "He says the fire feels warm now." Joseph stopped asking questions. There was a certain peace in pretending not to understand. Every time he looked at his daughter, he saw traces of his son. A small tilt of the head, a familiar half-smile, a way of staring too long at empty space. It was as though Elias had not died, but simply changed vessels. Outside, Allied forces crept closer. The rumble of distant artillery sometimes reached their windows, vibrating faintly through the walls. Yet within the apartment, no dust ever fell. No plaster cracked. The place seemed immune to destruction, protected by whatever power had claimed it. Neighbors whispered that strange sounds still came from within the Rosenfeld home. Murmurs, laughter, the clinking of dishes long after midnight. Some believed the family had already perished, and that only echoes of their lives remained. Others crossed the street to avoid walking beneath their window altogether. One evening, as snow fell thick and silent, Joseph sat alone at the table. The candlelight danced across his face, deepening the hollows beneath his eyes. Miriam hummed softly from the other room. Ruth was asleep, or pretending to be. He reached toward the puzzle, running his fingers along its cool surface. The metal pieces fit together so perfectly now, no gap between them, no flaw. For weeks, he had tried to take it apart and had failed. It resisted him like a living thing. He stared at it for a long time until, without thinking, he whispered, "Elias." The air shifted. It was so slight that he might have missed it, but the candle flame bent sharply, and the room's shadows leaned toward him. He froze. "Elias," he said again, this time louder. The silence that followed was thick, electric. Then a small, clear sound broke it. The faint clink of metal against wood. Joseph looked down. One of the puzzle's pieces had loosened on its own. He reached out to touch it, and the metal was ice cold. Beneath his fingertips, the piece turned slowly, realigning itself. Then from somewhere behind him, a small voice whispered, "It's time." He turned sharply, heart hammering. Miriam's humming had stopped. The air had changed, heavier, colder. From the corner of the room, Ruth's small figure emerged, eyes half open, her steps slow and mechanical. "He's ready," she said. "He said you can see him now." Joseph couldn't speak. He wanted to shout for Miriam, but his throat refused to make a sound. Ruth walked to the table and sat in the empty chair. The candle's flame dimmed, flickered, then steadied again, burning lower, quieter. Ruth looked up at her father, and for a moment her eyes were not her own. The softness of her gaze had vanished, replaced by something deep and still. Something ancient. Her lips moved, and the voice that came out was not hers. "You called me," it said. "You opened the door." Joseph's blood turned to ice. The voice was layered. Elias's, yes, but older, too, filled with others that whispered beneath it like waves breaking under the surface. He tried to stand, but his legs failed him. "Elias," he choked. My boy, what have you done? The voice smiled through Ruth's lips. I remembered, Papa. You taught me the prayers. You left the plate for me. You wanted me home. The candlelight deepened, filling the room with an unnatural glow. The shadows on the wall stretched, forming shapes, outlines of figures seated around the table, faint and flickering, like the ghosts of a vanished gathering. Joseph's breath caught. There were 4 shadows, one for him, one for Miriam, one for Ruth, and one more. Small, seated across from him. Elias, he whispered again. The small voice grew sharper. Do you know where I've been, Papa? Behind the prayers, behind the words you forgot to finish. They showed me how to listen. Ruth's eyes flickered rapidly, as though 2 minds fought for control. They said I could come back if I brought others. You left the door open. Miriam entered then, drawn by the sound of her son's name. Her eyes widened when she saw Ruth at the table. Elias, she whispered. Is that you? The girl turned her head slowly. Her voice softened. Elias's voice now, pure and childlike. Mama, he said, don't be afraid. Miriam crossed the room, tears streaming down her cheeks. She reached for Ruth, for Elias, and placed her trembling hands on the child's face. For 1 perfect second, everything was still. Joseph almost believed it, almost believed his son had truly returned. Then Miriam's expression changed. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her body began to tremble violently. Joseph lunged forward to catch her, but it was too late. The candle extinguished itself, plunging the room into blackness. There was a sound, soft, wet, and final, followed by a whisper that filled the air like a breath on his ear. Now she remembers, too. When Joseph relit the candle, Miriam was gone. The chair where she had stood was empty, her shawl fallen to the floor. Ruth sat motionless, her small hands resting on the table, the puzzle between them. Her eyes were normal again, but tears rolled silently down her face. She said she would go with him, she whispered. Joseph fell to his knees, the weight of loss collapsing over him in waves. He wanted to scream, to curse, to pray, but no sound came. The flame burned quietly, casting a circle of blue light across the table. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the glass of the window. Faint reflections of figures seated together, Elias and Miriam among them. They were not smiling, they were waiting. Days passed, or what felt like days. The world outside dissolved into snow and silence. The war's final roar echoed distantly, fading like a storm, moving out to sea. Ruth spoke little now. She spent her time sitting at the table, her hands folded neatly, her eyes unfocused. Sometimes she would whisper things that made Joseph's skin crawl. He says the others are coming, she said once, the ones who were forgotten. Joseph's sanity frayed thread by thread. He stopped leaving the apartment altogether. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, a slow heartbeat. The cracks that had once sealed themselves began to return, fine lines spreading across the plaster. At night, he would hear footsteps in the hall, not heavy like boots, but soft and bare, the steps of a child. The voice came less often, but when it did, it sounded closer, more human. Papa, sit with us. One night, the candle burned brighter than ever before, filling the room with a cold, blue light. Ruth stood beside it, holding the puzzle in both hands. He says it's time, she whispered. We can all be together again. Joseph rose slowly, exhaustion pressing down on him like lead. "Ruth," he said, voice cracking. "Put it down." She smiled faintly. "He says it doesn't hurt." The puzzle began to move in her hands, the pieces turning and locking into new shapes on their own, faster and faster, until it no longer resembled the toy Elias once played with, but something else. A circle, an opening. The light in the room dimmed, replaced by a deep hum that seemed to come from inside the walls. The air grew thick, heavy, electric. "Ruth!" Joseph shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the sound. The girl lifted her eyes, and for an instant, Joseph saw not his daughter, but the faint silhouette of his entire family. Elias, Miriam, Ruth, standing together in the candlelight, their faces calm, their eyes unblinking. "Come with us, Papa," Elias's voice said softly. "There's no fear here." Joseph took a step forward, then another. The light flared, brilliant, cold, and silent. When the building was finally cleared after the war, the Rosenfeld apartment was found empty. The table was still set for 4. The candle, though burned to its base, had never extinguished. In the center of the table lay the puzzle, whole, perfect, untouched. The walls bore faint impressions of handprints, small and large, pressed into the plaster as though from within. Neighbors whispered that the family had been taken by soldiers. Others said they had fled before the final invasion. But those who entered the apartment at night swore they could hear faint voices. A mother's lullaby, a child's laughter, the quiet clinking of metal on wood. And sometimes, when the wind passed through the broken window, the candle's blue flame would flicker, and a small whisper would rise from the shadows. We remember. And now, as this story closes, as the last candle burns low, and the ghosts of the Rosenfeld family fade, once more, into the quiet corridors of memory, I leave you with a single thought, the same that haunted those who lived and died between faith and fear. What happens to those who are remembered too strongly? If you have felt the chill of this story reach through the dark, let the light of your screen be your own candle. Like this video, if the echoes stayed with you. Subscribe to keep your light burning when the next story begins. And tell us, do you believe some doors should remain closed?